Also received a letter from the Honourable David Parker seeking to debate under Standing Order 386 the Government's decision to approve the sale of Crafar farms to a foreign purchaser, Milk New Zealand Holding Limited. This is a decision that involves ministerial responsibility. While the decision was actually made on 20 April, it was the subject of an appeal. The Court of Appeal has now found that the Ministers acted reasonably in granting consent for the sale under the Overseas Investment Act 2005 and dismissed the appeal. The judgment was given on 8 August 2012. This is the first time that the matter could have come before the House, and it is therefore one of recent occurrence. Given the significance of the matter, I consider it important enough to warrant the immediate attention of the House by way of urgent debate. I therefore call on the Honourable David Parker to move that the House take note of an urgent matter of public importance. The Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the finding of the Court of Appeal was that the decision was not unreasonable from a Wednesbury unreasonableness point of view, not that it was a reasonable decision. It was that it was a legal decision, not the right decision. The Court found that the Minister acted within his powers to approve the sale of the Crafar farms to the Pengjin Shanghai syndicate, but not that he acted reasonably, because that's not their mandate. Mr Speaker, I want to talk about what is wrong with this decision. I also want to talk about what's wrong with the underlying problems in our economy that drives the sale of so many of New Zealand's assets to overseas people. And I also want to put on record some of the inconsistent statements that we've had from the Prime Minister and others around these issues. Mr Speaker, the Minister approved this sale, the largest ever sale of dairy farmland, on the 20th of April, after his earlier decision for granting a similar approval had been overturned by the High Court because of a misapplication of the legal test. Mr Speaker, the largest ever sale of dairyland to overseas interests ever is of interest to New Zealanders, and I think it is appropriate that the Speaker, I couldn't think of inappropriate, but I agree that it is a matter of importance that requires the attention of this House. Why do I say that, and what do I say in support of that? Well, I would look at our history in terms of what's happened to our forestry industry. New Zealand lost large swathes of its forestry to overseas ownership in a very short period of time. Some of them approved by the Labour Party. Some of them approved by the Labour Party. What's happened to the forestry industry since then has been analysed by people like Brian Gaynor. Brian Gaynor has found that the loss of control of those assets from New Zealand has led to a smaller portion of the value chain accruing to New Zealand, because the forest owner who doesn't have an interest in New Zealand is less likely to want to process it in New Zealand and less likely to want to invest in the jobs that add value to New Zealand, more interested in only in their own profitability in terms of maximising the log price. We should in this House learn the lessons of history. If we do not learn the lessons of history, we are doomed to repeat them. Other lessons in history go back a bit further. New Zealand lost a lot of control of the value from the farming sector in the 19th century, when there were high levels of in the early 19th century, when there were high levels of foreign ownership of New Zealand pastoral land. As a consequence, governments in New Zealand tightened up on those rules for the benefit of New Zealand farming, and that's why we've now got Fonterra, because we have vertically integrated enterprises which have as their foundation New Zealand ownership of our land. Why should we? Another reason we should be concerned is because the Prime Minister told us we should be concerned. The Prime Minister in the last term of government, when there was public disquiet about the amount of farmland starting to be sold into overseas hands, said he thought that the concerns that New Zealanders had were legitimate. He said that National would tighten the rules in response to that. Well, what did they do? They passed a minor change to regulation regulations and pretended it was going to tighten the rules. The reality is that the discretion of the Minister to approve or decline land sales to foreigners is already very wide. The Minister had ample discretion to decline this application if the Minister wanted to, but he didn't want to. He wanted to approve it, and that's why he did, because it's a ministerial discretion. So when I hear the Minister claim he had no choice because it was a departmental recommendation, that is nonsense. And indeed, if he took the decision on the basis that it was a departmental recommendation, that would itself be illegal. So when he postures in that way in the media, he knows he's treading a fine line, because it is a ministerial discretion. And this Minister has a record of exercising that discretion in favour of applications. In fact, since he has been Minister, he has only turned down one application, and that was where the officials found that the applicants were corrupt. More than one, is it? How many? About seven now, but it's always on the basis that the people who are applying are corrupt individuals rather than the economics of the underlying transactions. The second largest ever sale ever approved to foreign buyers of dairy land in New Zealand was also approved by the Minister, the current Minister, and that was the sale of a very large dairy farm on the Maniatoto in my home province of Otago. Labor disapproved of it. Labor opposed that. We made public our disapproval of that at the time, and we weren't accused of racism for opposing the sale of big dairy farms in the Maniatoto to American interests, in that case the Harvard Investment Fund. The prior largest ever in land area and value of dairy land ever sold to overseas interests was a Southland group of farms sold to European investors. Again, the Labor Party opposed that. Again, in that case, the Labor Party wasn't accused of racism for opposing that particular sale of land to overseas buyers. But when we opposed the sale to Shanghai Pengjin, Mr. Minister accused us of being motivated and accused other people of being motivated by the fact that the purchaser is Chinese rather than the purchaser is of another nationality. You were on record for that. I'm sorry, but the record shows, not you, Mr. Speaker, but the record shows that the Minister asserted that people were opposed to Shanghai Pengjin purchasing these farms rather than others on the basis of their nationality, on the basis of their ethnicity. That accusation wasn't made in respect of our opposition to US purchase of the second biggest purchase, or European opposition to the European purchase in Southland earlier. The opposition of the Labor Party is not based on where people come from. It's based on what we think is the long-term economic interests of our country. More than ever, it should be apparent to the National Party that there are huge trade imbalances in the world. Enormous trade imbalances in the world. China is running the largest trade surplus we have ever seen of any country ever in the history of the world. Germany has had a trade balance that it has maintained on the back of a euro that is suppressed because of problems in the Mediterranean border states, which has acted to pull down the euro and keep up the exports of Germany because they've had a trade advantage because of their exchange rate. We've had other countries manipulating their exchange rates. We have these massive trade imbalances in the world, meaning that countries that are in trade deficits are funding those deficits through borrowing more money from overseas and through selling our assets that were New Zealand owned to foreign buyers. That's the only two ways you can pay for a current account deficit. And yet we have this government ignoring those realities and saying, look, we should just let all of our assets be available to be purchased by the highest bidder. That is just wrong. There is no economic upside for New Zealand selling these land-based assets. We are already the most efficient farmers in the world. We're not going to increase the farm output of these farms. Indeed, that was one of the reasons why the High Court upheld the appeal in the original decision, which was turned over. It was one of the reasons was they said that they weren't convinced that the additional investment which is going to be made in these farms and will increase productivity wouldn't have been made by a New Zealand purchaser. We know that New Zealand purchasers of farms increase productivity. That's how we've increased our dairy output. That is how Fonterra has thrived. Mr. Speaker, we don't need foreign purchases of those assets to increase the output of those farms, and indeed it's clear that the output of these farms would have gone up whoever purchased them, and New Zealand's output as a country will not go up as a consequence of these farm purchases. Even trade access into China isn't vastly advantaged through this. We already have a free trade agreement with China which gives us access to that market. So that's not a huge advantage from these transactions. The downside is that the future value from our farming sector, if we sell it overseas, goes to the foreign purchaser. That is a drain on our resources. Over time, we see the hollowing out of the New Zealand economy. We see this in a rising current account deficit. Our current account deficit is now a substantial part of it is profit flows, dividends and interest being paid to overseas lenders and profits being repatriated to the foreign owners. We will not get out of this loop with these sorts of policies, because this sort of sale makes it worse. There are non-economic reasons why we shouldn't be selling these assets. That's right. I want to live in a country where successful New Zealanders who work hard and save hard can buy our assets. I do not want our assets priced, or all of our assets priced, on an international market. Mr. Speaker, some assets should be priced internationally, some shouldn't. I don't want New Zealand to be a country where a share milker who works hard for decades, saves, can't afford to buy a farm. I don't want the only people who can buy farms in New Zealand to be people who either inherit large amounts of wealth or bring wealth from overseas. We are seeing the globalisation of trade. We're seeing the equalisation of prices for a lot of commodities, and we're seeing the averaging down of a lot of labour costs for labour-intensive goods. But we're not seeing asset equality. In fact, we're seeing asset and wealth inequality grow around the world. And if New Zealand opens itself up to those forces without protecting our asset base, we do New Zealand a disservice. Mr. Speaker, nowhere is this clearer than land. You know, we've got countries overseas that have had far less egalitarian settings than New Zealand for centuries. They've had lower rates of tax, they've had higher rates of division, and yet the beneficiaries of those settings in those countries are hugely wealthy compared with New Zealanders. Added to that, we've got the state-based control of enormous surpluses in some countries, and China's the obvious example of that. Those two factors combined mean that we are, unlike any moment in our history, at risk of overseas people being able to outbid New Zealanders for our assets. And that's not the sort of country I want to live in. I don't think it makes much difference to the economic output of New Zealand. I do think it increases our current account deficit over time, but it's almost as important to me that I live in a country where people can afford to own our own country. This government should be concentrating on what fixes that problem. It's the changes that we need to our investment signal through a capital gains tax. It's deeper savings so they've got more capital to invest in our manufacturing and our processing of our forest products and our fisheries. In the high-value manufacturing sector, we need more money in that sector through higher savings, and we need the money directed in there instead of into speculation. And the means to direct it there is a capital gains tax to remove that tax bias that currently puts investment in the wrong place. We need a research and development tax credit. What we don't need is to sell ourselves off to overseas countries for no good reason. No good reason at all. China doesn't let us buy their land. And yet we're saying we should have to sell our land to them. Mr. Speaker, this is wrong. It's not about China. I actually have my same logic applies to other countries that do let us buy their land. I personally don't think we should sell our land to overseas countries, our rural land. Neither do I think we should sell our infrastructure with monopoly characteristics. That's really important for the functioning of the wide. What's that? Actually, I turned down the sale of the Auckland airport to Canadian interests, so I will stand on my record. I recognise that, and actually I also turned down a dairy farm at the end of my tenure, and the world's changing. And if people can't change as the world changed, how moribund would be democracy? We might as well not have it. Mr. Speaker, I am firmly of the view it's not in our interest to sell our rural land, nor our monopoly infrastructure. It is a symptom of a malaise in New Zealand, which is that we do not export enough to cover the cost of our imports and interests, and those are the problems that should be solved. Those are the problems that, if solved, will raise incomes, will give job opportunities and stop those thousands of New Zealanders leaving to Australia.
The Honourable Maurice Williamson.
Mr. Speaker, having the